Here's an example of a colander, and this individual put a colander inside a colander. My suspicion behind that would be that they probably need a little stability because the one might fall over or whatever. And again, the advantage of the colander, these trees are going to be, one, water drains pretty quickly from them, and they might need watered more often, which is okay as long as we're keeping the healthy balance. But when we're also watering them and the water's draining out, it's pulling in new oxygen. So oftentimes when you grow a tree in a colander or an Anderson flat or whatever, they tend to get more vigorous root growth because of the amount of air exchange that's occurring. A pond basket is something you can get at the box stores, the box like Lowe's and Home Depot or whatever for ponds. They're also not incredibly durable, but they above ground, but they do a pretty good job and can also be used for that purpose. And these are tended to be used for trees in development. They're not used for trees that we're trying to refine, but because they can grow healthy roots. And when we're growing roots post collection, they're going to be coarse roots, which aren't necessarily great for refined bonsai trees, but they're great for the tree to recover when it's in development. Here's an example of a laundry tub, or not a laundry tub, dish tub, where somebody put a collected, I think it's a spruce or Doug fir or something in there. Let's see. Okay, the do's of potting. Okay, yeah, the right one. What do you do when you're going to pot? So if you're going to use pumice, 100% pumice, which is the recommendation, except Randy recommended to add some organic material, potting medium. I think it was like 70 pumice, 30% potting medium when doing spruces. He found that when he grew spruces in 100% pumice, they weren't doing as well because they're a higher water mobility tree than the typical pines and junipers, etc. And he found by upping his organic material, which makes the soil a little more moist, spruce that he collects do better. Also, leave in the 1/8 particle of the particulate in pumice. So, for instance, if you had sifters where you're sifting out your soil to get the different sizes, you would, if you had a 1/8 inch sieve, basically anything that fell through that sieve you wouldn't include, but anything that stayed in it, bigger, 1/8 or bigger, you would keep in pot. So if you had 1/16 sizes that fell through, they would not be included in your potting mixture, because again, when you're putting these collected trees, even though they have a lot of roots in pots, your goal is to get as much root growth as possible. Again, as we talked about with the mulch bed, set the roots or the root ball on the bottom of the pot, exactly how you would set it on top of the landscape fabric if you were sticking it in a mulch pile. Do not float the tree by sitting it on pumice or think you're doing it a favor by putting it up higher. If it sits too deep in the pot, cut your pot down, but make sure that root ball touches the bottom of the pot. And again, we're looking for 2 inches or less of clearance around the side of the roots, and we're going to put 2 inches of pumice right above the roots or the nabari. Our goal is to maintain the integrity of that root ball. Don't mess with it. Don't wiggle those roots inside that root ball. When you stick the root ball in the pot, you're going to put your pumice in, and then you're going to chopstick the pumice to make sure you get it integrated into all of the soil. If there's anything at the very bottom, you want to get it under a little bit, not underneath holding it up, but if there's little pockets near the bottom, you want to make sure that pumice is tight to the root ball. And then he also recommends he uses a sharp stream of water after he's chopstick it in to make sure it's tight, to again try to force the particles and move them around a little bit to get nice and tight. And obviously once you're done watering that for that day, you're done watering it. What's the best planting angle when you collect a tree? The best angle is what accommodates the root ball. If you're sitting there trying to put it in the position you think it's going to look best in it without regard to the roots, you're making a huge mistake. Because again, as we talked at the very beginning of this presentation, the roots are the most important thing. The roots, the roots, the roots. How the top is handled we're not going to do anything with it, and we just want to make sure that root ball gets into a pot or into the bed in the position that best serves the roots. So don't worry about the top, worry about the root ball. So that the best angle is making sure the roots are surrounded approximately, they're sitting on the ground with the base of the pot and 2 inches of pumice all around the sides and right above the root ball. Even if it's nowhere near the angle you want to plant it. So moves that enhance root growth. What are the moves that enhance root growth? Don't move it. Don't just do something, stand there. So again, stability, stability, stability. Keep those roots from moving. So once you put it in a pot, or once you stick it in the root or in the mulch bed, oftentimes, and I forgot to put a slide with this, we're going to use potentially rebar driven into the ground to be able to hold trees that are top heavy or whatever that could fall over in the mulch. Then we're going to have to make sure that there's rebar in there so that the tree doesn't move. If the tree's in a pot and we think it could move, we're going to somehow wire that tree to the pot or from the bottom through the holes, or we're going to stick pieces of blocks of wood. And bottom line is we do not want those roots to move in the medium, whether it be mulch or the pumice. Here's an example. If you look closely, I don't know if you can see my cursor, there's a little piece of block wood holding that branch up. And if right beside the wood is a little piece of wire that goes around the top of the trunk near where the first branches come out. And that's an example of somebody stabilizing a tree in the pot so it doesn't move. And if that's what you need to do, that's what you do. Keep your trees grounded. Survival rates for trees that are collected out of the field or in the landscape or whatever are usually better when they're set on the ground and remain on the ground. And if you want to increase your failure rate, put them on benches. And again, Randy wasn't sure why that occurred. He just is a good observer of what he did and found out that the trees on the ground had much better survival rates than ones he placed on benches. Now, obviously, some of the possibilities could be he moved when they're on benches, you move them. The other possibility is the temperature fluctuations up on a gosh, I'm blanking here. Anyways, if they're up in the air, the temperature fluctuations are greater, it's less humidity, and more likely to get impacted by the wind, and also the ground temperatures are not can keep things consistent. So keep the trees on the ground. Landscape fabric should probably be the only thing between your tree roots, other than the pot, than the tree. And also, if you're going to make a wooden box, don't put legs on it, and also no feet. In other words, have the bottom of that pot touching the ground. Some of the things that may be helpful: ground temperature is more consistent. It's warmer on the ground at night and it's cooler on the ground in the day. So yeah, ground temperatures are much more consistent than air temperatures. Something to think about even with our bonsai. There's a little part of me thinking, man, they might do a whole lot better on the ground if we don't have to worry about critters and things like that. Can't enjoy them, they're a pain to water, but anyway, something to think about. The other thing is that the ground, if the root ball is on the ground or touching the ground, or the pot like an Anderson Flats on the ground, the gravity column affecting the water is greater. So water is going to drain through because the gravity column is going to be from the pot to the ground, which is hugely, immeasurable, versus the only size of the pot. The humidity on the ground is higher. And also the other possibility of leaving things on the ground is we have microbial activity, which may enhance, again, I don't know this for sure, and having earthworms in your soil is hugely good. When you see that, that means you have a healthy system in there, and compost or warm compost has been found, at least definitely growing trees in nursery pots has been very, very helpful. Okay. The other problem, if you have it directly on the ground without landscape fabric, roots can escape and grow into the ground, which then you may have to cut them, and you're working really hard to get roots, and the last thing you want to have to do is cut something you work really hard to get. Maintaining a healthy balance of oxygen and water. So on these pots, when the first 2 inches are dry, stick your finger into the pumice. If you stick it about 2 inches, feels dry, time to water. I put aerate when the top 2 inches are damp. Basically, aerate means don't water. Let oxygen continue to get in there. So again, I want you to be thinking with your trees, whether it's bonsai or whether it's collection, how much air do they need rather than how much water they need. It's both. So, having that balance is what you're working for. And again, you water based on the pumice, not the root ball, because we're going to try to get the roots to grow into the pumice. And we are pretty sure that any fine roots or whatever in the pumice, in the root ball, are probably not going to survive anyway because they're going to be too wet. Encouraging root growth in pumice is what we're trying to do. And the other thing that we're going to do is determining how well things are going is look for signs of top growth on what you put in there. And that also helps you determine water usage. So if you have a tree that's stagnant and not doing anything, but it's alive, it probably doesn't need nearly as much water as the tree that is actually actively putting on growth. I have a solar room off of my kitchen, and a couple days ago, I was walking through and I had just watered my trees, I don't know, 2-3 days ago. Mostly I water them about every 7 to 10 days in the winter. But I looked at the crabapple tree and I touched it, and I had just watered it 2 or 3 days ago. And I said, wow, that really feels dry. I can't believe that. It's not been that warm. It was only like 40 in there. And I looked at the buds and they were starting to swell. So the tree was actually beginning to take in water. And so the top growth was telling me, or should have told me if I was looking at it, that the tree's beginning to use water. So I'm going to look at that. I'm still going to feel the soil. If the soil's damp at the 2 inches, I'm not going to water it, but I'm going to maybe check it a little more frequently once I know that I'm starting to see growth, because I could pretty much assume that it's going to start using more water. Okay, another environmental issues. Trees that have a minimal, so if you've collected a tree and it has a minimal root system, or even though it's a small tree, but it has a very small root system or a small root ball, especially relative, if it's small root ball, especially relative to the size of the canopy of the tree, it's wise to put those, if you have them in a pot, in dappled sunlight, because they're not going to be able to handle the transpiration required in full warm sun. So the other thing other than dappled sunlight would be morning sun, and then basically no afternoon sun, and that will help the tree not have to absorb too much water, because if the tree can't suck enough water as it needs to transpire, it will die. And if the tree has a compromised root system, it might not be able to keep up. Wind, avoid wind and increase humidity. And basically, if you want to avoid wind, you can put them up against a house, you can put them up, build a board, you can put up something to keep the wind off your tree, you can keep them closer to other shrubs, taller growing shrubs or things. The other thing is to keep trees closer to each other, which also can increase the humidity with the trees. Okay, and other environmental conditions, trees with lots of roots can be more quickly placed in full sun as they show signs of recovery. If the tree is absorbing water, which we talked about, and it's showing signs of growth and health, that means that the tree has enough to sustain. In other words, it has enough root system to keep itself green and alive and metabolically producing, but it also starts to add new growth. It's telling you, well, I'm getting healthy. I've got enough roots that I can keep what I've got going, and I can add some new solar panels here to make me a bigger tree next year. So those are the signs that your tree's doing well. If it's not adding new growth and it's green, that's good, but it's not ready. It's not going to be ready for much until we start seeing that adding of growth. And again, if a tree is beginning to do that, it's starting to show, yeah, I'm growing and I'm healthy, that tree should be placed in as much sun as possible, especially junipers. Junipers thrive in full sun, unless they're incredibly tiny pots. This is also with consideration of temperature. So you're going to put a tree into putting a tree into full sun when it's 70 degrees isn't the same thing as putting a tree into full sun when it's 90 degrees. So if you put your tree, because it's doing well and it's in the 70s, and for some reason we're going to get, we have a prediction it's going to go really, really hot and you then put the tree back into a more safer environment, maybe morning sun or whatever, until those temperatures drop to a more reasonable level. Wind desiccation, again, place your trees in a spot that's naturally calm or create a windbreak to avoid wind sucking too much water out of your tree. And again, if it doesn't have the roots to support the foliage, because one of the things, deciduous trees will put out foliage in the spring, sometimes whether or not it has the roots to support it or not, because it set itself up in the winter to do that, assuming that it had the roots. So oftentimes the tree has enough moisture in it without having to suck a whole lot from the roots to put out a whole lot of growth. But then as soon as the first warm day comes along and that's, the sun's hitting them and it starts to have to sweat or transpire and there's no roots for it to give, you may see a tree suddenly die. And I think I talked about that in the newsletter about with this winter that we've had, that it's possible if our trees got really severely root damage, it's possible that the deciduous trees could bud out and actually elongate and then all of a sudden die because they didn't have the roots to support it, and you won't know that. So, make sure that they're out and they've hardened off and are actually able to take care of some wind. And again, if you've had a tree in shade or shady areas, one of the things, you can't immediately put it out into sun. You have to gradually do it because leaves have cuticles as well as needles that have cuticles that they develop, which are harder outer surface that helps the tree not transpire as quickly. So if the leaves are still soft and haven't, or the needles are still soft and haven't formed that cuticle, you want to be slower in putting them into full sun. April showers or March showers, if it rains a lot, put them under shelter to avoid getting too wet. Again, if they don't get enough oxygen in their root systems, then they're going to die if they're too wet. So obviously, if they're in mulch, you're not going to pick them up and put them under shelter, but you could potentially put something over them to reduce that. Although mulch is going to drain pretty well. But for your stuff in pots, you might consider moving them. I thought I was doing better. If you move the tree into more sun and it starts to fade, move it back immediately. Don't say, I'll get it tomorrow or whatever. As soon as you start to see it fade, move it as quickly as you can back into the shady spot. If it's going to freeze, which we've been doing a lot of that, if it's in pot, again, Frozen was successful for children with movies, for the children movie, but it's not very good for our trees, and it's a box office bust. So if you have a freshly collected tree or you just repotted your bonsai and you're going to go below 32s, get that tree out of there because it can't tolerate it. Bring them in temporarily, get them out of the cold, and that's called the bonsai shuffle, back and forth and back and forth. And if you're doing bonsai, you get used to the dance. And here I say, you said don't move them. And I just identified all the exceptions to the rule. So again, you got this collected tree in a pot. You don't have to, don't move it. If you're going to move it incredibly carefully. Don't just, don't jostle it or whatever. So times to move it when it's going to freeze, it's getting too wet, it's getting too hot, it's getting too much sun, it's getting too much wind. But again, move it carefully. How will you know that it's getting better or it's growing or how well it's doing? A couple of things to be looking for. The first two things are what it's not doing. If it's not losing color and it's not dropping foliage, that's a good sign. So the tree's saying, I got enough to sustain myself, but sorry, I haven't got enough to give you any more. That's all I got. If it's not getting disease, that's a good sign. Means at least, it's holding its own and, and it's not getting that, because plants and trees, their immunity system comes from a healthy root system. And so that's a good sign. If you start seeing roots coming out of the bottom of the pot, that's a really good sign. That means you're getting something. If the top starts to show signs of health, meaning it getting a little more greener than it, or more typically green, and getting to the color that most trees that you've collected, or that's what they look like, that's a good sign. Also, if you start seeing new growth, you start seeing the tree adding a few more leaves, or it adds a few more needles, or starts pushing out its buds, that's a good sign that the tree is recovering. Now, maybe it might have small buds, or the candles on the pines don't extend very much, but they extended a little. So that means it's like, okay, I got a little to add here. I'm not doing great, but I can give you a little bit. So again, that means that tree's coming along, but not maybe as great as you want. Now, if it puts on vigorous growth, boy, that's an awesome sign. And again, the other thing you're going to be looking at, especially in the pots, not so much in the mulch, but you're still going to check if the tree's starting to use water and it's drying out. That suggests that the roots are starting to absorb it. But typically, if it's absorbing water, you're also going to see top growth with that because it's using that water to do something. Now, let's see. If all goes well, you've collected these trees, you should see roots by September. We do get root growth in our trees in the spring. Actually, I just repotted some of my Dawn redwoods, and the white tips had actually begun to elongate already. So you do get some root growth in the spring, and you get some branch expansion, or that's called root and branch, it's vascular expansion. You get some of that, but the vast majority of that starts in early fall to mid-fall, where you're going to get the root growth or whatever. So you might begin to start seeing some in September because that's when it happens. This year, I planted some potted trees in the ground in, I think, mid-August. And it was like 2 to 3 weeks later, I couldn't move them in terms of when I went to wiggle them to see, to see if they had taken. They had within 3 weeks of having put them in, which was about the time I wanted to get the roots to grow. It was amazing. So you get a lot of vascular growth at that time. Also, you're going to see, okay, so I just lost my train of thought, but I'll get back on it. So the best scenario, if you collect a tree in the spring, you should hope to have roots in September, October, but you're not going to do anything anyway with that tree until the spring. So don't disturb it. Don't go checking. Don't go moving around the soil to find out. And I'm speaking from experience. I do stuff like that, checking on my air layer, wiggling it around to see if it's growing. There's other than being happy something's happening. It's by checking it, the worst you get. You're not going to help it, and you can hurt it. So just wait and to check it out, especially in the spring. So don't lift it out to figure it out.